Let's think about this portrait as part of a tradition of royal portraiture. It presents a very convincing likeness. The face is so individualized. All of the fabrics, clothing, elegant accessories are meticulously described. The artist is a master of Baroque illusionism, so that we feel as if we are looking directly at the king himself. But of course that's not true. The painting is not a mirror showing the actual king. It's a rhetorical statement in paint. Its purpose is to idealize him as the ultimate king, the embodiment of absolute monarchy, exerting sole command over France. So we need to think about this portrait as part of a long tradition of royal portraiture, of art serving as political propaganda. Louis's portrait follows in the footsteps of his grandmother, Marie de Medici, who capitalized on the power of art to glorify and legitimize the ruling class. She hired the international art star Peter Paul Rubens to paint a series of massive, grandiose paintings depicting the history of her marriage to King Henry IV of France. This painting, in fact, makes a theme of the role art plays in power relations, how art is a kind of glue, cementing diplomatic relationships, strengthening dynastic lines, which is what marriage was about in this time. Even though Henry IV seems to look longingly on her as if he's very much falling in love, really this is about a portrait of a woman who will become a co-ruler and about the forging of political bonds in a dynastic system. The system of royalty and nobility, this dynastic system, is of course about the passing on of wealth and power through family lines based on titles such as duke, prince, king, and also the claim to the territories that go with those titles. So here's a portrait of Marie de Medici, older than she was in that fantasy portrait where she's being presented to Henry IV. And this is the son of Marie de Medici and Henry IV, Louis XIII, who will grow up to father Louis XIV. Rubens is doing a few things to enhance the rhetoric of power, to idealize these rulers. One is he's making them very beautiful. Certainly, we've got Cupid pointing to Marie de Medici, and as if saying, and look at the little expression on Cupid's face, as if saying to Henry, wow, isn't she quite lovely? And then you see the tilt of his head, Henry IV, and the kind of elegant, tall body, as if he's almost like a dancer hybridized with a warrior in his military arms, his armor there. And then, of course, this other thing that Rubens does is he surrounds them with figures from Greek and Roman mythology. Up on this cloud looking down from the heavens, you've got Jupiter with his mascot, the eagle. He was the Roman version of the Greeks' Zeus, so he's sort of the king of the gods. And his wife, Hera, the goddess of the hearth. And how appropriate then to have the deities who are the married couple at the apex of Mount Olympus, standing over and smiling upon this couple, the implication being they are the earthly equivalent of Jupiter and Hera. So it's important to notice how much classical mythology, the images and ideas of the classical Greco-Roman past, had thoroughly become the language of the ruling class in Europe, the way of expressing their sense of themselves as deserving power, of displaying it, was by likening themselves to either the rulers from the Roman Empire or even the gods and goddesses. This figure represents the personification of France herself, who seems to be just sort of clutching her chest, excited that her king is going to have this marvelous queen. and that they will build a family line. So it's interesting to look at this portrait of Henry IV and compare it to what Rubens did, because this guy does not look nearly as gracefully elegant with the long boots and the swaying posture. He doesn't look like Zeus or Jupiter, a Greco-Roman god come to life on earth. He looks like a regular guy in some awkward pantaloons. And so it's helpful to notice how some artists of a certain caliber like Rubens can make the mythology of power even more believable. This is much more of a straightforward portrait. He doesn't seem like a god. So a painting like this by Rubens is not just a portrait of this queen and king, or queen-to-be. It's a mythologizing of them, their marriage, their power, their role as rulers in France. So it's interesting if we go to the chapter on France in the textbook and we see the historical context that they draw here. The first thing they say is that the historical reality of 17th century France was marked by almost continuous foreign and civil wars. So that confidence expressed in the Rubens painting is not the reality. In fact, Henry IV gets assassinated in 1610. And he's assassinated partly in terms of the religious wars that were still going on and were part of these series of civil wars. He had actually been a Protestant who, in coming into the throne, converted to Catholicism. France is, at this time, a mainly Catholic country, although there is a Protestant minority who are embattled and in conflict with the Catholic majority. So although he converts to Catholicism, for many of the more fanatical Catholics at the time, this was not enough. He was not a real Catholic, and he was assassinated. As they say, this left France in the hands of the Queen, Marie de Medici, as regent for her 9-year-old son, Louis XIII. And that tells us a lot about her motivation for hiring Rubens to make those gorgeous, impressive action portraits of herself and her husband, because she is the regent, meaning she's ruling in the place of her son, who is the heir to the throne, but not old enough to take the throne. And so she is making the decisions as his guardian, if you will. And this is a precarious place to be for a queen. The misogyny at the time is very hardcore. So a queen inheriting the throne when her son is not yet of age is already vulnerable to palace intrigue, to plots against her control. And so her paintings made by Rubens are very much about legitimizing her rule. This particular painting shows the dead Henry IV being whisked up into heaven by Jupiter and the gods, the Greco-Roman gods, as the queen in mourning, Marie de Medici, receives from that figure of France an orb symbolizing the control, the power, the rule over France itself. And so notice how glorified the king is, and how there's a sense of all of these figures bowing down to her, everyone recognizing her right to rule. These paintings are about insisting on the right to rule. So the king was not always secure in his power and territory, because you have to remember these dynastic systems were part of feudalism. They were a feudal order, meaning there was a hierarchical structure of landowners, wealthy landowners with title, owning fiefs, a big chunk of land, having title to it, and they were supposed to be serving the king, those nobles, the nobles who might have the title of duke or count. But in reality, they were sometimes more wealthy and better positioned than the king. So I'm showing you a map here because I'm going back a couple hundred years to make that clear. This map shows you the Kingdom of France. There's Paris over there. So this is the territory of the King of France, but his brother, the Duke of Burgundy, has some really wealthy land here and controls some non-contiguous land over here that's very wealthy, highly economically booming. And the Duke of Burgundy actually has more money, is more of a wealthy art patron, and isn't bogged down in some major wars. He's in a better position than the king. So the king has to contend with rivals, and that is what is changing with Cardinal Richelieu. So when the textbook says that Cardinal Richelieu, here he is in this portrait, this triple portrait, that he set out to increase the power of the crown at the expense of nobles, what does that mean? Well, if you look at the portrait, it's brilliant. It's a very rare composition to show the two profile views with this three-quarter view of him from the front. It's ingenious because it gives you the feeling of this powerful intelligence. Look at his gaze, the intensity of his gaze as he looks back, as if he's thinking things through from all sides, plotting and planning. Richelieu understood that nobles like these pictured here in front of their castle with their land that produces wealth, that their political interests allied with their own needs, that they were mostly concerned about their self-interests. And although they're supposed to have allegiance to the king, that's not in fact how it worked. They're wanting to amass wealth, they're wanting to safeguard their territory and to expand their power when they can through marriages. And so Richelieu, although he's a cardinal, right? He was a priest at 20 or 21 and made a cardinal. These are his cardinal robes. Even though he's a religious figure, remember that religion and politics are not separate. He's a shrewd, calculating power broker. And he is aware of this, so he works systematically to disempower the nobles, down to even sometimes destroying castles. And in other areas, doing things like pulling out their influence in the bureaucracy that runs the civil service, in pulling out their influence in the army and navy, and building up the king's control over the military. All in all, centralizing control in the hands of the king and leeching away the power that the nobles had accumulated. So by the time Louis XIII's son, Louis XIV, becomes ruler, this position of an absolute king who has no rivalry with the nobles has been solidified by Richelieu, and then by a follower, an apprentice of Richelieu, if you will, Mazarin, who essentially completes the work that Richelieu had started. So this is a critical idea to understand fully when we turn to, the ultimate idea to understand when we turn to the palace at Versailles. Look at the scale of this monster of a palace. This is a palace that has Louis XIV seeming to open his arms through this architecture to grab all of the territory, and at the same time to pull in all of the nobles who must live here now under his command. So I want you to really think about the architecture as we read it, not only in terms of style, because it is a classicizing style, and that's very important, but also in terms of scale and also in terms of purpose and what we could call the rhetoric. Rhetoric is, of course, language used to persuade. So here, how is the language of form, of style, used to persuade the people who came to this palace to confront the Sun King? How is it used to persuade everyone that he is the absolute monarch, the Sun King? As he famously said, "L'état, c'est moi." The state, it's me. I am the state.